Hey, welcome. This is great. It's just so much fun seeing so many people here on a Wednesday night. I absolutely love it. And I'm going to start, and I'm going to do my best not to talk too quickly, because I somehow told myself I could get through 2 chapters of the book tonight. And then when I sat down to look at everything that went into those 2 chapters, I thought, okay, so there'll be more in the book. If you read these last chapters, you will get more detail and a few more options, but it turns out I can't do all of them tonight. But it's still, we're gonna be great. We're gonna wrap up the arguments we've been dealing with. If you'll just start with me with a word of prayer. Lord, thank you again for this community, just for the faithfulness of this church body, for the huge blessing that it is in the life of my family. I pray that we would be a blessing in the city of Tampa and to all of our friends and family and everybody that we encounter. I pray that you'd be with us tonight. Guide me, guide us all, and just be here among us. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so we started out in the first week talking about the problem of evil, and I said that there are kind of 2 ways that you can understand what evil is. On the one hand, there's just bad stuff, really unpleasant stuff that nobody likes. On the other hand, there seems to also be moral evil. It seems like there is also right and wrong and good and bad in ways that are actually meaningful and that go beyond just unpleasantness and things that we wouldn't prefer. And we talked about how suffering is sometimes used as an argument against the existence of God. And then last week and this week, we've been looking at how moral values, like evil and good, can be used as an argument for the existence of God. So that's where we are. That's my quick recap of the last 3 weeks. And today is when I make the case that when you consider the reality of objective moral values, when you consider the fact that most of us actually believe that morality is a feature of reality, that morality is a feature of reality, when you try to understand why that would be and how it would come to be, theism is a better explanation than atheism. Moral values just make more sense in a world with God than they would in a world where there was no God. So that's the case I have to make tonight. In the book, this is 2 chapters. Because, when I grew up as a kid in the church, I kind of had the idea that, obviously, if there's no God, nobody can tell me what to do, right? Obviously, if there's no God, there's no right and no wrong. But the truth is, atheistic philosophers don't agree about that. They do put significant work into trying to ground morality without God. So a whole chapter in the book is dedicated to looking through those, and we're going to look at most of them, but not all of them tonight. Because if you want to know that theism is the better explanation, you need to understand what the rival explanations are, right? So we'll look first at the atheistic attempts and then move to the theistic attempts. There we go. Here are just the quotes that I begin with. This one you've heard before. This is Sartre, who is an existentialist and an atheist. And in the preface to this quote, he's talking about some of his other French philosopher friends. And he says, look, they've gotten away with the idea of God, but they like to tell themselves that we can do so at no cost, right? You get rid of God, but you get to keep everything else, like morality and good and bad and right and wrong. And he writes, existentialists, on the other hand, find it extremely disturbing that God no longer exists. For along with his disappearance goes the possibility of finding values in an intelligible heaven. Dostoevsky once wrote, if God does not exist, everything is permissible. And this is the starting point of existentialism. So the truth is, it isn't just theists who believe that morality makes more sense given theism than atheism. Historically, plenty of atheists have held this same position, right? And then a quote from Dawkins' River Out of Eden. He writes, as that unhappy poet A.E. Housman put it, for nature, heartless nature, will neither know nor care. And he goes on and he says, DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is. And we dance to its music. So again, 2 atheistic voices here just pointing out the difficulty in finding something like value in a world without God. So this is the argument we've been looking at. It's an inference to the best explanation, which is a common form of reasoning. It's actually the same argument form that the most successful argument for atheism on the basis of suffering uses, right? The truth is, philosophers very rarely use logically deductive proofs for such big things. They do it, but in any case, it says, look, there are objective moral values. We defended that premise last week, so I won't be defending it this week. And the best explanation for the existence of objective moral values is the existence of God. That's the one that we're working on this week, right? Therefore, God probably exists. But one last recap is necessary, just a little reminder, and we'll move on. What do we mean by objective moral values? Well, the definition we've been using is Robert Adams' definition of objective, where he says they're objective in the sense that whether they obtain or not does not depend on whether any human being thinks that they do, right? If they're objective, then it's not up to us whether they're true or not. It's not up to anybody, not the person, not the community, not the culture. Their reality is independent of what we think about them. That's what it means for them to be objective. And what does it mean for them to be moral? Well, they're moral in the sense that they tell us about like the right act as opposed to the wrong act. They tell us which of our acts are right and which are wrong, or which would be right, which would be wrong. But also, what would make for a good life? What would be a flourishing life? I'm moving quickly right now because so far this is just a recap of last week. I see a lot of new faces, so I feel bad, but I'm going to slow down now as we get to the newer stuff. So objective moral values are moral in that they talk about what should be, not just what is. That's really what it comes down to. Philosophers use the word normative instead of being descriptive. They don't just tell you what is the case, they tell you what should be the case. They don't just tell you where you are, they tell you what you should do and how you should live. It's the should that's so important, that distinguishes morality, right? Not that there aren't any other kinds of shoulds, but the moral should. You should morally do this. Okay. So, I'm going to start reading a little bit now. As I said, I'm going to explain today why I think theism is the best explanation. And I want to share a quote actually here. On the left is Robert Adams, and all right, I'll read this. I'm deciding I don't want to overshoot my time limit, but so Robert Adams, who we saw last week, but he says, look, one of the most generally accepted reasons for believing the existence of anything is that its existence is implied by the theory that seems to account most adequately for some subject matter, right? What does he mean by that? Well, look, we think that physics is probably true. Well, let me read this. Physics does the best job of accounting for observable reality. Physics implies the existence of dark matter. So we accept the existence of dark matter. We don't actually get to investigate dark matter up close, right? This is not the kind of proof we have of dark matter, but physics does the best job of explaining the world, and if physics is true, dark matter exists. So we think that dark matter exists. Likewise, if theism does the best job of accounting for morality, theism implies that God exists. So believing in a certain moral theory, this is what he says. He's like, well, look, so my meta-ethic gives me some reason to believe in God. Not a conclusive, knockdown, no one could deny it proof, but some evidence, right? It seems like this is the best way of accounting for morality, and if this is true, God exists. So that's some evidence that God exists. Interestingly, the guy on the right is a guy named Eric Wielenberg, and he wrote a book called Robust Ethics. And it is an attempt to, you'll hear more about him tonight, it is an atheistic, moral, realist account. So Wielenberg says, I don't believe that God exists. I do believe that objective moral values exist. And he dedicates a whole book to trying to explain what else might ground God, might ground morality. But here's what he writes. He considers, actually this is Matt, I'm sorry. This is a quote from Mackey, not Wielenberg. In any case, he's responding to this. He says, we might well argue that objective, intrinsically prescriptive features, nope, I'm going to stop for a second, because I have gotten myself all confused here, which is not good. 2 quotes here. Okay, good. We might well argue that objectively, intrinsically prescriptive features, objective moral values, just in more words, right, supervening upon natural ones, constitute so odd a cluster of qualities and relations that they're most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events. without an all-powerful God to create them. So this is Mackey. J.L. Mackey is another atheistic philosopher. I misread my own chapter, which is a little embarrassing. This is Wielenberg quoting Mackey. But the point is this: these are two atheistic philosophers talking to each other, right? And they're saying, look, the existence of something like an objective moral value that just arises on its own out of a fully natural world is weird. It's a very unusual kind of thing. So if there are these values, they make the existence of a God more probable than it would have been without them. The point of that is that, again, those are atheistic philosophers saying, if morality really is objective, that does seem to be some evidence for the existence of God. It's in response to this worry that Wielenberg writes his book, right? He's like, I'm going to try to save objective morality for the atheists without accidentally defending the people who believe in God. But of course, you might ask, like, I don't know, when you're looking for the best explanation, why do we even need an explanation? Why do objective moral values need to be explained? And again, the best answer for this comes from an atheist. I'm going to come back to that slide. This is again from Sartre, right? And Sartre writes, when we think of God the Creator, we usually conceive of him as a superlative artisan. So whatever doctrine we may be considering, say Descartes or Leibniz, I don't have the whole quote there, I'll skip down. Thus, the concept of man in the mind of God is comparable to the concept of a paper knife in the mind of a manufacturer, or, a particular pot in the mind of the potter, or a plate in the mind of, I guess, another plotter. Thus, each individual man is the realization of a certain concept within divine intelligence. So this is Sartre again. I'm still talking about the atheists. And he's like, when we think of God as a creator, it's really easy to figure out what man is. What is man? Whatever God made him for. Whatever God had in mind when he made us. So if God does not exist, really nailing the slides tonight. If God does not exist, there's at least one being in whom existence precedes essence, a being whose existence comes before its essence, a being who exists before he can be defined by any concept of it. So then, man is nothing other than what he makes of himself. And this is when he says that existentialists find it extremely disturbing that God no longer exists, right? This is a big deal, and Sartre actually thought his fellow atheists weren't taking it seriously enough. It's very easy to tell yourself, we don't need God for morality. We don't need God to have meaning in life, right? We don't need God to know what humanity is, what man is. And Sartre was like, no, we do, actually. We did. Everything that we think man is rests on this idea that we were made by God. So without God, we got to start over. And what do we have to do? We have to create human nature ourselves. It's up to us. There's no one else to do it for us. So, I'm going to skip back a little bit to the slide that I put in the wrong spot. I apologize. I was scrambling today. I said that morality involves both the right action and the good life. And we talked about this a little bit last week. But I want to say one more thing about it. I want to make sure we really talk about this notion of a telos. Or the teleology is the sort of discipline that thinks about this kind of thing. A telos is what we would call the end of man. In fact, in Scripture, when somebody says to Christ, the end is near, that word is telos. They're saying the end, the telos is here. And what is a telos? It's not the end like where you land. It's the end at which you are directed. So, the proper end of an acorn is an oak tree. And there's no spinning a story where the acorn who got smashed by your car wheels and never turns into an oak tree lived a flourishing acorn life. It's false. That acorn failed to thrive. It didn't didn't achieve its proper end. An acorn that never becomes an oak tree has failed at being an acorn. That's what it's for, right? It used to be that science was full of teleological notions, and it's actually, people still talk like this It's harder. I'm not going to go on that tangent. So the question is, does man have a telos? Does humanity have a telos? Is there a human telos? Is there something that we're supposed to be doing with our lives? Is there something that our life is supposed to be directed at or not? And Sartre says, actually in the end, Sartre wants to say yes, it's just up to you to make it. He calls this radical freedom. It's very high stakes. It involves things like despair and anguish. Doesn't sound fun. But this is the second aspect of capturing morality. It's not enough to just get this question of whether actions are right or wrong. You also need some way of understanding what it means for a human life to be a life well lived, what it means for a human to flourish. Okay. Now, the problem that Sartre notes is that, we weren't actually designed by anything, he says, so we don't have a design plan. What that means is, if there's a human telos, that's the kind of thing we have to invent and not discover. Do you see the difference between something that you discover because it's there to be found and something that you invent because it isn't, right? So one question that has come up a lot is this. Well, look, a common way, by analogy, a common way of arguing for the existence of God is by appealing to the evidence of design in nature, right? Intelligence, design arguments, fine-tuning arguments. But in response, atheistic philosophers point to the process of natural selection. And what looks like design, they say, is really just the result of a particular evolutionary mechanism. So can an analogous move be made here? And yes, in recent decades, a number of philosophers have defended accounts in which our shared moral values are seen as just the result of Darwinian evolution. It's an unsurprising move. It's what you would expect. And in this sense, you basically get something like design without a designer, right? It's not quite design. It looks like design. And maybe design's not even quite the right word. But you get something like moral values, even if there's no person like God, no divine being who established these values, they came out of this process of evolution. So interestingly enough, look, we have already read quotes, like the epigraph to that chapter that I just read is from an earlier work of Dawkins's, where he was like, look, nature's blind forces and it doesn't care how you feel. Stop looking for objective moral values there. But in more recent Dawkins, he does want to say that maybe we have, I don't know if he would use the word objective, but as you'll see, it's objective in some sense. He wants to try to find a way to get right and wrong and good and bad out of the natural process of natural selection, out of evolution. So I'm going to read this because I think that font might be too small. So he writes, here's what he talks about. We're all mostly, in fact, the youngest person in the room is my child, so well, maybe not. In any case, we have the biological impulse to reproduce, right? The impulse to reproduce, though, sticks around even if you are not necessarily with somebody who is still fertile, right? Dawkins is like, where does this come from? Where does sexual desire come from? It comes from your biological desire to reproduce. It's not that discerning, right? So it misfires. So even if you're past the point of reproducing, it's still something that you want to do. And then he goes on and he says, I'm suggesting that the same is true of the urge to kindness, to altruism, to generosity, to empathy, to pity. In ancestral times, we had the opportunity to be altruistic only towards close kin and potential reciprocators. Nowadays, that restriction is no longer there, but the rule of thumb persists. I'm going to stop for a second. Here's what he's saying. It used to be evolutionarily advantageous to be kind to people. Why? Because we lived in small communities. And if you went around murdering people, you'd get kicked out of the community and then you would die, right? And if you went around being selfish, people wouldn't help you. And then when you got sick, you would die. So it used to make sense. We don't live in those communities anymore, right? It's not as essential anymore that we take care of those around us. But our genes don't know that. These are mechanisms that have been honed, he would say, going back for forever, right? And so he goes on and he says, look, we can no more help ourselves feeling pity when we see a weeping unfortunate who is unrelated and unable to reciprocate. So he's like, this person can't actually help you. Then we can help ourselves feeling lust for a member of the opposite sex who may be infertile or otherwise unable to reproduce. Both are misfirings, Darwinian mistakes, blessed, funny word, right? Blessed, precious mistakes. So, all of this, I just wrote too much for myself this week. I apologize, guys. Let me just try to sort of condense Dawkins's position. He's famous for this term selfish genes, right? He thinks what people really are just like vehicles for our genes. That's why he says we dance to the music of DNA, right? Why are our genes selfish? Because the truth is our biological impulse, if we're just talking from his evolutionary perspective, it's not that we want to have a lot of kids. It's not that. It's that our genes want to reproduce as much as possible, right? This is what our genetics want to do. And that means that either you have kids or people who are genetically very similar to you have kids, right? Your immediate family. And we are like little vehicle carriers for the selfish genes, and we are governed by the impulses of our selfish genes. And this is where we got morality, right? The best way for our genes to get themselves out there into the world for a long time was through kindness and altruism and things like that. And those things still linger. But so, all right, like what makes these things objective? Well, we actually do get some rules. And because we're all members of the same species, there is a sense in which these are objective, which is to say, whether they obtain has nothing to do with like what you think about them. So, what are the rules? Well, an action is right for Dawkins. These are my words, not his. This is me summarizing him. An act is right when it accords with a general rule that historically has tended to maximize genetic reproductive success. It's wrong when it accords with the general rule that historically has tended to undermine genetic reproductive success. Why do I add in all those disclaimers? Because he's quite clear these are not highly, finely tuned principles. He calls them general rules of thumb, right? And again, he's also clear. This is why I said 2 chapters was maybe too much for tonight. I apologize. It's not that he thinks you should be thinking about this when you act morally. That is not what evolution is selecting for, right? Natural selection is not looking for people who are thinking about reproducing their genes. This is all supposed to be something your genes do through you without you thinking too hard about it at all, right? The goal is just to get your genes out there. So the right act is the one that over history tends to give your genes a chance at success. And the wrong one is the one that doesn't. You keep killing people, your genes are not going to get out there because someone's going to kill you. Right? And the good life, this one is a lot harder, right? If anything, you would say a good life is a life that tends towards genetic reproduction, either through my offspring or my genetically similar kin. So if humanity has a telos here, a proper end, what the oak tree is to the acorn, it's just to reproduce. But really, for Dawkins, that's the end of your genes, not yourself. That's really more like a telos. That's what your genes are directed at. I know this was quick, but I'm going to move on because I need to get through a lot, and I suspect most of you don't find that a particularly compelling. Just reading facial expressions, I'm getting the impression that no one is drawn into that view. But we're going to talk about it a little bit. Okay. So in this one small way, Dawkins' account of moral values could be said to satisfy Adams's definition as being objective, in the sense that whether they obtain or not doesn't depend on whether any human being thinks they do. So Dawkins' evolutionary, values are maybe objective, but it's not at all clear that they're moral, right? To be an objective moral value, to come up with a process that explains the existence of objective moral values, you have to capture the objectivity and the morality. You gotta be able to get a should out of this thing, right? So one really simple problem is some people don't want their genes to reproduce. Some people actually choose not to have children simply for the reason that they think that the genetic risk is too high because of genetic conditions that they have. Does that mean they should pay no attention to morality now? Right? If the whole point of morality, if the thing that grounds morality is genetic reproduction, and you're like, well, I definitely don't want that, do we actually believe that gets you off the hook, morally speaking? I mean, it seems very clear that we don't. I don't even think that Dawkins would think that we would. In any case, okay. In an earlier paper, one that I teach at USF, actually, Dawkins introduces this example of something being a useful fiction. If you think about the term horsepower, we use horsepowers to accurately convey the power of an engine, right? I don't know cars, so I actually am going to totally fail at giving a good number here. But you describe an engine in terms of its horsepower. Used to correspond to the equivalent number of horses it would take, but I don't think we would use that many horses anymore. But as Dennett says, like, horsepower means the same thing in all engines, and it's a really helpful way to quantify a really complex set of measurements. It's a very useful shorthand for something that might otherwise be difficult to talk about. But as he says, this is a quote here, don't look in the engine for the horses, right? This is a useful fiction. There is no like actual feature that is horsepower. That's a shorthand for something else, right? And when it comes to horsepower, we can see why this fiction is useful. When it comes to morality, it's not at all clear that it is useful. In the first case, because what about people who don't want to reproduce? But look, we can go further, and really we should. We should push this account. Because so far, I have granted Dawkins' suggestion that altruism, pity, and kindness are genetically advantageous. It's not at all clear to me that evolutionary history would bear this out. I think it's at least as likely. If you want to find out whose genes got propagated, I think it's at least as likely that the violent wielding of power, racial and ethnic insularity, and sexual promiscuity were the recipe for success among our evolutionary ancestors, right? There's just, I don't think it's historically accurate to say, well, if you look over history, it was the kind people who had lots of children and whose people survived. I don't think that's true. And the truth is, if you spend, I actually don't spend any time here, but I hear from people who do as observers, any time on like the alt-right, far-right web, you'll find that young people have gotten a hold of this, and they're like, yes, evolution grounds morality, so it's all about passing on our genes. So it is all about racial segregation and insularity and being able to have sex, whether you manage to always get the kind of consent that society says you have to get. Why? I mean, that would, as a matter of fact, lead to, or it certainly could lead to, pretty good reproductive success, right? Your genes are going to get out there. You're going to be with genetically similar people if you make sure you stay away from other races and other countries and things like that. But here's the question, right? Let's just imagine something. Let's just suppose that we were to discover today, either through a historical study or a sociological study, that rampant sexual promiscuity and rape, coupled with racial and ethnic isolationism, has actually been the most successful path forward for our selfish genes. We can disagree about how likely this is, but the likelihood doesn't matter, so stick with me for a minute. It doesn't matter. Let's just imagine that actually the best way for your genes to reproduce, the best way for there to be more people genetically similar to you in the world, is through violence. Just suppose that it were true. In this land, what would we conclude? Would we say, well, I guess these things are moral? Even Dawkins wouldn't. Dawkins would not. If Dawkins stumbled upon some study that said, yeah, it turns out violence and racism is the best way to get your genes out there, I know from other things he's written, Dawkins would not say, now you have my moral blessing to act that way. He would say, maybe we need to rethink it. I was wrong about evolution being the root of all of this, right? Because again, he's not a moral monster. So no, I think in the face of such a discovery, it would seem overwhelmingly likely that we would all persist in condemning this behavior as morally wrong. right? Even if we found out that it did lead to genetic success, we would still condemn it as morally wrong. But what does that mean? That moral rightness and wrongness is just not the same thing as genetic reproductive success. Whatever the latter is, it's not morality. Okay, so what have we looked at so far? We looked at why morality needs an explanation, right? In particular, why even certain atheistic philosophers think there's a weird tension between the world they're trying to describe. We looked at maybe an alternative that's not quite objective moral values, but at least sort of objective, and at least explains why we all feel so strongly about morality and should maybe keep doing moral things. But there are also, as I said, these people we call atheistic moral realists. So this is Stephen Willenberg, Peter Singer, Philippa Foot. Philippa Foot, is the one who coined the trolley car example that most of you have seen if you watched the show The Good Place. Or if you've ever taken an intro to ethics class, you've heard her famous trolley car example. And then Sam Harris, all the way on the right. And the truth is, these four people offer very different accounts, and they all write whole books about them. I just can't begin to do justice to the complexity of each of these four individual accounts. But they do all have one thing in common, and that's the feature I want to focus on today, right? They all rely on something like the following as their sort of general line of reasoning. Moral values seem to be objective. We can just see the truth of our shared moral intuitions merely by reflecting on the nature of what it means to be a human being and what it means to suffer. No serious, morally sensitive person could dispute the truth of these moral principles. They're just self-evident. So they use different moral theories, have lots of different beliefs, but at the core, that's the general line of reasoning for all four of them, right? Their starting point is this, well, for Harris, it's kind of the whole thing, but their driving claim is, all you have to do is look at the world to know that you should help the hungry, unless you're a monster, right? It's just obviously true that there are things you should do and things you shouldn't do. It's just obviously true that a life lived in a terrible, selfish way where you just hoard all your resources and ignore everybody else, that's a bad way of being a person. This is obvious, right? One of them, Harris, he's the only of the four, goes so far as to say, wrong way. Oh, even, hang on. He goes so far as to say, yeah, it's so obvious that Harris is an interesting character because he likes to write books. Have any of you heard of Sam Harris? Probably have friends who think, people read him and sometimes like younger people think he's brilliant. Let me just tell you, my atheistic philosopher friends, these are not fictitious people, these are friends of mine. He's an embarrassment, right? It's bad philosophy. And part of the reason it's bad philosophy is because he will tell you, Sam Harris, he finds philosophy boring, he doesn't like to read it, right? Well, okay, but if you're gonna write philosophy books, it would be good if you read some of them too. Harris is like, yeah, no, this business that you can't get an ought from an is, that we talked about last week, nonsense, of course you can, right? So I used the example last week about, your friend brought an extra sandwich to lunch and you had no sandwich, you forgot yours. And she said she only ever ate one sandwich, but she'd like to keep the second one. And you went through how she totally recognizes that she has more food than she will eat and you have no food. She recognizes all of those facts, but she doesn't agree that she should give you a sandwich. And the point is, you can agree on all of the descriptive facts about the world. You can agree about all the things that are. And if you don't agree about what should follow, you won't draw a should kind of conclusion. You can't just use what is to get to what you should do. The only way to get to a claim about what you should do, only, is to use a principle. When this is the case, this is what you should do. You actually just need moral values to get moral values. Now, Sam Harris thinks, nah, no you don't. But there's like an actual addendum to his book where he addresses all of the people, all of the philosophers who he likes and respects, who have written him to tell him how he's wrong about this. He's still not persuaded, but the truth is that he ought to be persuaded. Because the problem is that he's confused about, let me find this quotation, excuse me. There we go. Sorry. Peter Singer sort of very gently tries to explain where he thinks Harris goes wrong. Now, this is me reading a podcast transcript, so it's not going to be as clear as Singer's writing usually is. But he says, look, I think there's a fine line between saying from the description that we can deduce what we ought to do, and between saying that when we reflect on what suffering is and when we reflect on what happiness is, we can see that it's self-evident that we ought to promote happiness and we ought to reduce suffering. Singer thinks, and I think, in fact, what Wielenberg says is, ethical facts can only be explained by other ethical facts. So what's going on here? Why does Harris think it's fine, think it's like not a problem? Because it is self-evident. It is obvious to any morally sensitive person, change the slide here, that there are objective moral values. That's obvious. He's right about that. Sam Harris is absolutely right that a morally sensitive person should see that moral rules hold whether you believe in them or not. But that doesn't do anything about the second premise of this argument. It doesn't in any way explain the objectivity of these. What the atheist is asked to do and what the theist is asked to do, when we say you can't get an ought from an is, we're saying, yes, there are these oughts. How did they seem to come out of a world that's just descriptive? Who gives the should claim? Who's the law? If there's a moral law, who's the lawgiver? If there's a moral standard, who's the standard bearer? And if there's no lawgiver and no standard bearer, where are these things coming from? That's the question that Harris just misses. Maybe because he finds philosophy boring. I don't know. But we can absolutely agree, right? I think that we can absolutely, wholeheartedly agree with all of these guys that it is totally self-evident that moral values are objective. It's very clear, self-evident's a strong word, but it's pretty clear that if morality is something you just get to make up, it doesn't deserve the name morality. So this strong human intuition that they tap into absolutely gives us reason to believe in the first premise of this argument that there are objective moral values. It just doesn't touch on how you would go about explaining them, right? So one more view we need to look at, and we'll look at the theistic positions. This is Wielenberg's newest book. It only came out a couple years ago. And, sorry. Excuse me, guys. I keep doing that tonight. I guess I'm going out of order. But Wielenberg's answer is what explains the existence of these like real, actual, non-physical, they're more, if you've ever taken a philosophy class, he thinks they're more like abstract objects, kind of like Platonic forms or something, right? So they're facts about reality. So somehow the world came about through something like the Big Bang and evolutionary processes, and as physical stuff was being distributed, somehow out of that came a moral law and moral standards for humanity, right? And he says, if you want to know how I can explain their existence, we can't explain their existence. This is what we call a brute fact. Now, Wielenberg is right that philosophers appeal to these things sometimes called brute facts. Why? At a certain point, not everything can be explained in terms of something else, right? Otherwise, you would go on for infinity and never achieve an explanation. There are certain things that just seem to be true. We're going to talk about some in a minute, things that we think might be properly basic. You can believe them and not on the basis of something else. It's just that morality seems a weird thing to put forth as a brute fact. First of all, usually we call something a brute fact because we can't explain it, and it really seems inexplicable. Like there's something about it that seems like the kind of thing that couldn't be explained by something else. So Wielenberg says that, he's like, look, I'm on the same footing as theists because they say the existence of God is just a brute fact. First of all, they don't really use the term brute fact for that, but they do say that, yeah, look, God's existence doesn't depend on anything other than God. That's true. You can't explain the existence of God in something more fundamental than God. Why? There isn't anything more fundamental than God. If there were, God wouldn't be God. So the very idea is if not contradictory, it's certainly extraordinarily hard to understand. So why do I say moral values seem to not be like this? We already have a whole host of reasons why we might have moral values. I mean, maybe, right? Maybe they're just kind of the leftovers from when society used to believe in God. Maybe they're fake. Maybe they're just a story we tell ourselves because we're still holding on to this idea of God, right? Maybe they're these weird rules of thumb that tended to give us genetic reproductive success. And so, or maybe, right, as we're about to say, maybe they're the result of a creator God. So we have three rival explanations for why we would have these moral facts. And when you have three potential explanations, I think you're in a tough spot to just say, no, these are the kinds of things that actually can't even be explained. But this is an interesting book. And this book is one of the reasons why I think the best way to make the argument, the moral argument, is in terms of the best explanation and not trying to prove that it's impossible for anyone to even try to make sense. There are atheists who believe that moral values are objective. I think their worldview is really ad hoc. I think it's very strange to try to think that the world is entirely natural, entirely the result of blind forces, but also, fortunately for us, the world itself says we have to be nice to each other. That feels like a weird fit to me, right? But it is a worldview that some people have. So, all right, I'm going to wrap this up and go to the next chapter. I'll just do this. So, here I have two quotes. One is derived from Genesis. God created the human in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And then a quote from Aquinas. Among all human pursuits, the pursuit of wisdom is more perfect, more noble, more useful, and more full of joy. So here we have, why did I use these quotes, right? Well, if theism is true, especially if Christian theism is true, then we don't exist before we have an essence, right? We do exist, having been created in the image of a God. And there is a good life for us. And what is the good life? It's this pursuit of wisdom, really in the form of the pursuit of God. Pretty straightforward answers. In the atheistic worldview, objective morality would be a surprising discovery, right? Again, Sartre, Dawkins, even early Dawkins at least, Mackey, these atheistic philosophers who are like, if there's no God, I don't see where we get morality, right? So yes, you can be an atheist and make the case for it, but the reason you have to write a whole book to make the case for it is because it's a little bit of a hard sell. It's a little bit of a weird fit. But in a world created by a loving, perfectly good God, objective morality is just exactly what we should expect to find. I want to give a few resources that theism has, really. A few resources that we have that are going to help us. This is on the left. Anybody know who that is on the left? Louder, Lou. It's Calvin. And on the right, it's Calvin's biggest fan, Al Plania. He was my dissertation advisor and Frisbee golf friend. We also played Frisbee golf together. He would always say, "Whoa, Nelly," when somebody threw a really long drive. Whoa, Nelly. Okay. So, okay, here we are. Inference, the best explanation. I'm just going to read this paragraph because I wrote myself a note to read it. So, when we're looking at the second argument, right? A world that came about as the result of chance. This is what I said before, but I'm going to say it again. A world that came about as the result of chance is just not likely to be a world where we can speak truly of the right or wrong act, or the good or bad life. In the words of Sartre, seems more likely to be a world where man simply is. But in contrast, if there is a God, and if that God designed and created the world in which we live, then we should expect to find features of the divine nature, like goodness and rightness in the created order, right? So another thing that we should expect is to have been designed to recognize right and wrong and good and bad, right? If we were created by God, then we should expect to have been created in such a way that we would be sensitive to moral values. So when we hear this consensus among quite a lot of atheistic philosophers that we all really do just know what's right and wrong, and that you're kind of a moral monster if you pretend that you don't. Well, theism says, that's true, and I can explain that, right? That's true, and let me tell you why. So there's this thing in philosophy called basic beliefs. Plantinga did not invent basic beliefs, right? This concept of a basic belief. The idea is that some things you believe on the basis of something else, and other things you don't, right? Plantinga writes, every train of arguments will have to start somewhere. And the ultimate premises from which it starts will not themselves be believed on the basis, on the evidential basis of other propositions. They'll have to be accepted in the basic way. That is, not on the evidential basis of other beliefs, right? So an example that he gives is you're sitting at the window and you look outside. If you see birds, you believe there are birds, but not because you formed an argument in your mind. Or I'm having the visual experience of birds. And if I'm having the visual experience of birds, that probably means there are birds outside. Therefore, yes, I'm going to conclude that there are birds outside on the basis of like this belief and that. No, when you see the birds, you just believe there are birds out there because perception is a faculty that we use to form basic beliefs. Those were a lot of philosophy professor words. But perception is a human faculty. It's something that we do, something that our brain does, that our body does. And it's something that we do to form basic beliefs. When you see something, you believe it. Now, obviously, if it's a very dark room, you shouldn't trust what you see in any conditions all the time, no matter what, especially if what you see is like a video. But if you're in the room with somebody in good lighting and you see something happen, you don't typically stop and ask yourself whether you should also believe that it happened. Do you see the difference? Like some things you come to believe because you were taught them. And when you're taught them using things that you already believe, usually, right? So maybe you learn addition first, and when you have a basic sense of addition, you can kind of, no, this example's not gonna work. All right, some things you believe on the basis of other evidence, other things you believe just because you believe them basically, because you have a reliable faculty that you can trust, and they're just fundamental. So perception is one, memory is kind of one. But what Plantinga said, by drawing on Calvin's idea of a sensus divinitatis, right? Calvin was the one who proposed this, and he's like, I think we don't just have a faculty of like perception to observe outward reality, right? We also, when I say the word faculty, think like your perception, your imagination, the understanding. These are all things that you do. Calvin said, I think we actually also have a kind of sense for God himself, a sense for divinity, a sensus divinitatis, right? And here's a line from Plantinga. Look, he says, look, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of his hands, Psalm 19, but not by ways of serving as premises for an argument. In this regard, the sensus divinitatis resembles the faculties of perception, memory, and a priori knowledge. That's just like logical reasoning. Am I moving too quickly, or is this kind of coming together a little bit? Okay, so planning is like, I think we have this thing. And actually, the truth is, it's so hard. You cannot overstate how pivotal Plantinga was in the development of contemporary Christian philosophy. Basically, in this book, Warranted Christian Belief, he's like, look, you can be not just a theist, but a Christian on the basis of reason that is just as good as like your perception, right? You can be a reasonable, thoughtful, reliable, intelligent, actual Christian believer. But what's especially helpful here is, if he's right, if God did in fact give us this faculty for discerning signs of God in the world, presumably they also help us to discern the features of God, right? Goodness is just resemblance to God. Rightness is just accordance with God's desires. So, okay. All of us, let me just read this. Our intuitions about moral judgments are really powerful. They're widely shared. They're difficult to resist. We see the wrongness of infidelity and parental negligence. We see the wrongness of sexual trafficking. I mean, like, you don't need to be persuaded these things are wrong. When you learn of them, you know they're wrong, right? We see the wrongness of physical and sexual assault. We see these moral facts, and even Harris, Singer, Foote, and Wielenberg would agree that the person who fails to see them is deficient in some important sense, right? This deficiency is a malfunction. So the question becomes, what does it mean for a person to malfunction in this way? For the theist, the answer is clear. We were given a faculty for discerning God, and you malfunction when you ignore it or don't use it, right? If God exists, if we were created by God, we should expect the properly functioning, created person to see the truths of morality as a part of objective reality. So in contrast to atheism, theism offers a straightforward explanation of how and why we all come to share a set of objective moral values. How? By exercising our proper function, including the sensus divinitatis, and forming beliefs on that basis. Why? Because that's what we were explicitly designed to do, right? So yes, everybody agrees we see moral truths, but the theist can tell you how we do and why we do. So in a book, Ethics in the Real World, Peter Singer, atheistic consequentialist philosopher, actually considers this view and rejects it. And he's like, look, perhaps a divine creator handed us these universal elements at the moment of creation. But an alternative explanation, consistent with the facts of biology and geology, is that over millions of years, we have evolved a moral faculty, like the sensus divinitatis without God, right, that generates intuitions about right and wrong. Here's what I'm going to say. On Plantinga's view, God designed us and gave us this faculty so that we could see his work in creation and follow his design for our lives, right? On Singer's view, evolution somehow selected for a moral faculty. But look, that means there have to be moral facts to discern, right? Otherwise, what are we perceiving with this faculty? Let me say that again, because that's a little bit complicated. Singer says that maybe evolution gave us a sense like vision, right? A perceptual apparatus that will reveal to us moral values. But do you see that that means they have to be there in order to be revealed to us? He still hasn't answered the question of how they got there and why they're there and how this resulted from, as Dawkins says, a world that just is. DNA doesn't care. Blind forces seem like an unlikely candidate to construct moral principles. If they did, sure, evolution might select for you to be able to find them, but you can't find them if they're not there. Okay. So, how do we construe the right act on theism? Well, a really common view, I'm going to hustle now. A really common view is divine command theory, right? This is easy. The right act is doing what God said. The wrong act is doing what God said not to do. Now we're done. But many of you may have encountered this in college. I don't know. It's called the Euthyphro Dilemma. This is Bertrand Russell restating Euthyphro's dilemma. And he just writes, look, if you're quite sure that there is a difference between right and wrong, you're then in this situation. Is that difference due to God's fiat, or is it not? If it is due to God's fiat, then for God himself, there's no difference between right and wrong. It's no longer a significant statement to say that God is good. If you're going to say, as theologians do, that God is good, you must then say that right and wrong have some meaning, which is independent of God's fiat. Because God's fiats are good and not good, independent of the mere fact that he made them. Look, the short version is this. Is something good because God said so? Is it good because God commanded it? Or did God command it because it's good? This is a puzzle, comes up a lot in undergraduate classes. And the obvious problem is this. If you want to say that something is good just because God commanded it, then it seems like God could command awful things, and it would be wrong of us to disobey them. That's the problem, right? So Robert Adams says, finding this conclusion unacceptable, I prefer a less extreme or a modified divine command theory, which identifies the ethical property of wrongness. What he's saying, he's like, we can just define wrong in this way, as being contrary to the commands of a loving God. Since a God who commanded us to practice cruelty for its own sake wouldn't be a loving God, This modified divine command theory doesn't imply that it would be wrong to disobey such a command. What's going on here? Adams is like, look, what do we know about God? Well, look, Robert Adams is a Christian, and he's like, I'm not particularly interested in following God's commands unless he is a loving God. But if he is a loving God, then his love ensures that what he commands cannot be wrong. A loving God is not going to set out to harm other people. So, sorry. All right. Okay, so in this way, Adams invokes the perfect love of a perfect God as the ultimate grounding and explanation of rightness and wrongness. The theistic God is not morally arbitrary, right? The theistic God is and must be a loving God. In fact, Adams goes on to argue that actually God isn't just good, he is the good. What do we mean by that? If you want to know what goodness is, it is the person of God. If you want to know what the standard of goodness is, it is God himself. Anybody who's read any Plato knows that Plato thought there were these eternally existing forms, these kind of standards by which things were or were not certain things, right? And Plato thought the highest form of all was the form of the good. And Adams says, Plato was close. If there is such a thing as the form of the good, that is God. God is the form of the good. It's actually, okay. So, what's the right act? One way, and I want to be clear again, I'm sorry I'm going a little quickly tonight. What I'm giving you here is like a condensed version of my 2 chapters, which is a condensed version of all the literature that it's out there. The goal is to give you kind of a taste of what Christian philosophers are doing. So I wish I had one more week and could have slowed down today a little bit more. But this is one way. We looked at a variety of atheistic ways. One theistic way of making sense of the right act is the right act is what a loving God tells you to do. And the wrong act is what a loving God tells you not to do, right? So what's the good life? Well, here's one good answer: to glorify God and enjoy him forever, right? It's just a pretty straightforward human telos. What is the purpose of man? What is the end of man? That's a pretty straightforward answer. Or you could go to Aquinas. Hey, Rich, are you up there? Oh, there we go. Oh, man. And on our stump, again, on Aquinas. She says, on Aquinas' view, for all human beings, there is one and the same intrinsic upper limit to the scale of objective value, namely God and shared union with God. And Adams goes on, if God is the good itself, then the good is not an abstract object, like Plato thought, but a concrete, not physical, but concrete individual. Indeed, it's a person, or importantly, like a person. And finally, in one of my favorite books, C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, he writes, one of his characters says, right? There is but one good. That is God. Everything else is good when it looks to him, and bad when it turns from him. Now, again, depending on how you're thinking about this, you might be thinking, I don't know, right? You got to believe in God to believe all of this. Here's the thing. We almost all believe in objective moral values. Most atheistic philosophers think they ought to be obvious to you, that if you don't see why you should be moral, there's something wrong with you. The question is, how can we say that there's something wrong with you if you are not designed by anything, right? It's not possible for a rock to fail to be a good rock, right? I mean, I don't know, maybe God has some design for a rock that I'm not aware of. But rocks don't seem to come out with an obvious purpose, right? They just kind of sit there. And it'd be a weird thing to walk by a rock and say, you're doing a really terrible job of being a rock, right? Just awful. You're the worst rock I've ever seen. I mean, maybe, right, if you set it down and it crumpled, you would say, yeah, you're terrible. You're at least supposed to sort of stay as a solid hunk of something. But I don't know, if I spilled paint on the paper, right? If I just took paint and I just threw it on the paper, would I expect that to look like anything? Would I expect that to have been a right way or a wrong way for it to have landed? If we just came into being because of the expansion of matter, what does it mean to say we're malfunctioning when we don't see moral values? But if we were created by a divine mind, and a loving divine mind, we could absolutely fail to do what he made us to do. We could absolutely malfunction. We could not fulfill the purpose that he had in mind for us when he made us. So if you start with the commitment that there are these obvious moral values, theism makes better sense of them than atheism. So I think theism is the best explanation for 3 reasons. By this notion of the sensus divinitatis, by saying that we were created with a faculty to discern God and morality, right? It explains why we might all come to share similar moral intuitions and why we might hold them with such confidence, right? If somebody really believes something morally, it's pretty hard to dissuade them without good reasons. Now, it's not hard to tell yourself a story when you want something that you think it would be immoral for you to get, right? But barring those circumstances where we're just being selfish and telling ourselves stories, people are pretty committed to their moral views, the ones that they care about. So theism explains why we share these moral intuitions. It also makes it easier and more sensible to speak of the right act and the wrong act, because it really does seem like a moral law calls for a lawgiver of some sort. It seems like evolution does a terrible job at that, right? It seems like it being a brute fact that could never be explained is not the best approach if there are alternatives, and God seems like a clear alternative. And finally, whereas atheistic commitments undermine the likelihood of a human telos, right? As Sartre and Mackey and Wielenberg note, right? If there's no God, it seems less likely that there's a purpose for humanity, a design plan here. Excuse me. Theism fully explains both this notion of a human telos and a meaningfully shared good life. So, I don't know, on atheism, our moral intuitions, which we all know we have, right? They could be the lingering relics of our attachment to a non-existent God, or they could be rules of thumb intended to maximize reproductive success for our genes, or they could be brute facts about the world, unexplained and unexplainable. Alternatively, our keen awareness of moral truth could be the result of our status as well-designed creatures, properly functioning in a universe designed by a loving God. The theistic picture tells us that moral values are real and objective parts of reality, rooted in God and present throughout the universe.